Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is, where you're at. My name is Brendan McNamara, and this is Totally Classic. I am joined, as always, in these leaps, bounds, and dances into third rail topics by, I was going to say the one and the only, but there have to be other people by your name, but you're the only you there is. So you can go ahead and say your name now.
Yeah, and Mr. Rogers says that's a wonderful thing to be. I am Andy Swindler.
Do you actually? So today's topic is about intersectionality, and the way this is my selection topic. So the question is intersectionality useful? There's plenty of things to define in here, but I did want to speak to, because I rarely speak to this, because I find the entire realm of, like, quote unquote experts say, as at least for myself and many people I know, that as soon as an article, let's say in the paper, says something like, well, experts say, or according to experts, blah, 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 or blah, 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 experts say, means immediate dismissal. That is not a legitimate thing. That's not a useful metric. But I think today might have at least some glancing elements that would relate to that. And so I'm just saying that with all appropriate, like, preamble, that yes, I'm not saying that anyone's expertise, training, or experience makes them immediately or impeccably more able to levy useful information. And I think that's in general a false apprehension that many human beings have. But setting that aside, not only is it wonderful to be you, but what about your experience, or even like in the realm, I know this is reductive, in the realms of like job titles, would make you a good person for me to talk about intersectionality to? Or is this a terrible topic and I should never have brought it up? Those are your only options.
the first credentialing, I think, that's come up in our show.
Yeah, I wanted to experiment with that. Like, I wanted to experiment this time with like a little bit something feels like an opening. Hey, you're listening to this show. Check it out.
I think credentialing is anti-intersectional, so I'm going to start there.
Oh, perfect. Good. I'm glad it is, man. If it's something, if it had that as a tenant, then I would be leaping on board.
Well, I say that somewhat cheekily, but I think so. I don't know. One of my current titles is Chief Empathy Officer. So I think that's a big piece of it. Is,
yeah,
you know, born into or out of, or both, of empathy is the idea of actually seeing an individual for who they are, as you introduced me.
Yeah.
In that, I've been kicking around this phrase for a few years, like the ultimate diversity is 8 billion sovereign souls.
Yeah.
They're all totally unique, right? That's like impossibly unique. Like, we can't possibly, I don't think a person can actually conceive of 8 billion different stories. And yet there are, right?
Mm-hmm.
You compare two siblings that grew up in relatively similar, households, you compare two people, whatever, who grew up in similar places, and they're going to have totally different stories, totally different reactions, totally different personalities. And so in a way, I think it's been, it's always valuable kind of batting these things around with you. And I think we might have a similar kind of struggle with, on the one hand, holding this beautiful uniqueness of people on the one hand, and then also trying to, I think a lot of our discussions are trying to pick apart the value or the potential harm of a lot of social sciences, which inevitably categorize everything.
Yes, yeah.
It's just part and parcel to trying to develop a science, at least the way we tend to do it. It's like that. I don't know how high we were in college when we said war is about numbers, so you can subdivide that shit.
It's true though, man.
So true. And we slice things up and we categorize people and we group them. And I sense that's a lot of what you're sort of pushing against in this particular conversation, or at least questioning really deeply and interrogating, is like, well, why? Like, why is it useful to talk about these categories? I have gone pretty far down the path of thinking, well, these categories tend to help me understand how somebody's identity may intersect with the power structures. may intersect and interact with the power structures of our society. And that's, I think, something we're both constantly questioning, but I see you also interrogating, as well as where, like, the data, like, show me the data. Like, I don't, like, you're not settling for anecdotal data that there are power structures, or that a particular categorization is actually even mostly true, let alone, I mean, none of these are 100% true for a group of people.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and then it's, some of that is A, that's how I think, and then B, that's also like looking forward to be like, oh, okay, when could this get problematic? I mean, and again, this is not even really something I've been deeply thinking about in its application until this pandemic, until like in high school and college, and then even just like randomly, if I was interested in a topic, I would go just have some autodidactic tendencies. But definitely during the pandemic, there was a lot of stuff being thrown at us, and I was like, not all that made sense. And I was like, I don't want to listen to people talking about this stuff anymore. Show me the stuff that you guys are looking at, and and I'm going to go analyze it myself, because your analysis seems whack. So let me go look. Let me go see if what you're, and then how do we figure out which experts are expert, right? Other than their own assessment. And then in looking at, for example, like COVID related science, right? You could easily discover that, oh, like, what was it, like 80, 89 or 90, something like that percent of people being like hospitalized for COVID early on were obese. So you're like, oh, like being obese was like a significant chunk. I mean, it's almost monkeypoxy, and funnily enough, right? We're like, well, pretty much almost everybody, but they didn't want to talk about that because it's stigmatizing. And I was like, oh, wait, that's weird. So there's an identity thing that's starting to interfere with just explaining things. And then I was also like, well, but at the same time, the stigma danger points to this danger, right? Which is like, okay, almost all people who are being severely harmed by this disease, we're locking society down, are in this particular condition, which is a fact, which is a multi-hued, like, why are people obese? There's no one answer. It's not like, well, it's genetic. Sometimes, you know what I mean? But at the same time, you don't want to then start looking at all fat people and being like, look at those COVID spreaders. They're the ones killing us all. They're the one, you know what I mean? So it doesn't become an absolute identity. All we're talking about is statistical, increased statistical chances or whatever. So we're actually talking about something that is, it's an important little Lego piece. But I think there is a tendency in the human mind, or the social family, to take the Lego piece and make it like a whole house and be like, well, that's the house then. But then the problem is, then they put the house down at the bottom of a pyramid of things that they start building. So then they start building on that as though it's a house. And I think that's definitely where I get into the like, hold on a second, wait, no, we gotta, let's start being real clear with our language. So wait, do you also coach? I also wanted to know, somebody asked me this question. So this is actually the first question for our podcast. They were like, is he a coach? We've heard him mention coaching a couple times. And I was like, well, I know Andy has done some quite a bit of like purpose-based coaching, sort of especially in the corporate world, even more so than the personal, but probably both. And then I know you've actually sort of sat under coaching in many other circumstances, but are you also like a coach in the like DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion space, which would kind of be adjacent or kind of semi-incorporated Venn diagram-ish with intersectionality? I ask you that because that would ramp up your expertise level for people tuning in.
Oh yeah. In a sense, yes. Yes, so I have a certification. I have a few certifications, coaching specifically from the True Purpose Institute, both for one-on-one and small group coaching. And then I also have a certification in True Purpose Consulting, as well as a few other categories. And I mean, DEI is such a young industry. There aren't a ton of credentialed programs. There are a few. Yeah. I did take a 2-day intensive a few months ago with a local Chicago consultancy called Ethos that I really, really respect. And I think there's a lot of compatibility with how we see it, which is a lot about empathy and belonging, and just slow down enough, to see each other and look at these challenges with really sober eyes and as well as we can. So I haven't done a lot of coaching in the last 3 years as I've turned my attention to building Feel Real, this network of space holders.
Mm,
And certainly a lot of space holders are coaches, and that can be a pretty
sure. Yeah.
qualifier. But it's, I don't know, it's almost like not the main one. I don't
Okay.
know, I feel like space holding is kind of adjacent to coaching.
Yeah.
So I haven't done a ton of coaching formally in the last 3 years.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question though, because pre-pandemic, I designed like a workshop around allyship,
Mhm.
and kind of combined some of the things I had learned, because the coaching is a cool combination of, some great grandchild of like Jungian psychology and
Mhm.
inner parts work, and just kind of untangling a lot of our programming and our patterns, so that we can actually open up a channel to something we might call divine wisdom. We tend to call it trusted source. I think you could call it God, or what is there another term you typically use for God?
No, but what you're talking about, I don't even know what I'd refer to that as. I'd probably have to come in and actually be part of the training, and then I'd be able to tell you what my version of what you're talking about would be.
Cool.
But you've been in more training sessions, and I know in many ways throughout this program, this will probably continue. I'm vicariously attending these sessions every time I get to talk to you about these things, because I ask all the questions. I ask you all the questions I would ask if I was ever in a training session of these various and sundry sorts of the subjects that I'm bringing up anyway.
Yeah, and I never want to assume anybody really of any religion or spiritual path feels the same way about God. So I always love learning about that from you, both your own personal relationship and interpretation, as well as Christianity at large.
Yeah.
That could even be its own generalization.
Yes. Of the two of us, I probably, yes, I have more expertise credentials from within the Christian church.
But it's and this may or may not be your relationship with God, which is interesting. But it's essentially like some entity, some non-human entity that you feel you can what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know why it's not coming up. Convene with. That's not that you can have a dialogue with, that's two directional, that you can ask questions and get some answers. Just a little.
I have a very interesting, this is already total, obviously, like we're deep in the weeds already, but I have a question about that. In this case, it sounds a lot like, it reminds me of Alcoholics Anonymous, right? The whole idea of the quote unquote God of your own understanding, which need not be an actual God itself. Like, so for example, in that, like, as people are kind of like identifying whether they have to say it out loud or not, I'm assuming they don't, but you're like, everyone kind of define for yourself what that thing would be.
Yep.
Can it be defined as something that does it ever matter whether that thing does or does not exist? You know what I'm saying? So like, for example, you could be like, I talk to a godlike version of myself who is kind of an invention of my own mind, but provides me with an excellent sounding board for me to be able to sort of in some ways speak to other elements of myself that I might have otherwise ignored. Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah. The criteria. So as a coach, I can't tell somebody whether their trusted source is legitimate, but I can say the criteria for it to be legitimate are that you believe it exists. That's literally the first one.
Oh, okay. Oh, that is the answer. Okay.
That you believe you can talk with it, and that it knows your purpose, and that you believe or trust that it can tell you and will tell you your purpose. Those are the.
Oh, okay. And then wait, there isn't this, okay. I was like, wait, I thought the first question might have answered it. Maybe it doesn't, because existing, okay. I was like, yeah, so that checks part of the box. Do you also have to believe that it's something that is separate from you?
No, there's three categories of trust sources.
Okay, got you.
Internal, personal, and universal. So internal would very much, and these categories don't matter that much. They just help the more analytical mind kind of make sense of the groupings.
Yeah.
So the internal one often would be maybe a soul, or even a higher self could theoretically be a sort of an internal trusted source.
Yeah.
Intuition. I mean, if you really want to leave the spiritual realm and just talk about words like really, I think, what this is. And then personal would be outside of you, but still kind of unique to you. So often that might be a dead relative, like some kind of spirit.
Oh, okay, got you.
Commune with, if that's the word I was looking for there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And then universal is going to be a trusted source that knows everybody's purpose, and that's typically like God,
got you.
Gaia, or the universe, or something like that.
Got you. Okay, that's very helpful. Have you ever been paid in either barter or capitalist funds for anything related to intersectionality, anti-racism, DEI? Have you ever been? Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
I was actually recently. I mean, that's part of what we're trying to do with Feel Real, is actually elevate the space holder economy. And the way we define space holding, there's an essential component of it that is at least culturally aware. That's probably the most neutral kind of way to define it.
Yeah.
And our bias is, more DEI, kind of social justice-y. And I was recently part of a very, very cool facilitation here for a group outside of Chicago. And it was a bunch of African drummers who they're performers, but they had a cool idea to bring in. What's neat is like each of them are from a different part of Africa. So
totally different rhythms. Yeah. It's so cool.
Like 26 years. Funkadesi is their name, and it was such a neat idea, because it was like these, and I'm a drummer, right? But I don't even know if I can fake African drumming, but the whole thing was designed around, we've all got these different rhythms. And so I thought it was a pretty cool approach to inclusion, the I part of DEI, which is like, how do we blend our rhythms in a way, not just saying like, oh, this rhythm must dominate all other rhythms, but like, how do we? And so we literally broke into these different groups, each with a different drummer, and learned that rhythm. And then we all came back into a room together and merged those rhythms. I don't even know, there were probably 150 people. It was really fantastic. And then I was actually hired for the next part, which was like 90 minutes of like holding space. Like, so to me, like that's the part of DEI I love, which is just how can we build a small container where we can be vulnerable together and really share.
Nice.
So there's parts of it that I don't think I'm qualified at all to do, like the equity part. Like that's like analyzing somebody's governance, HR governance and hiring policies and things like that, where I'd be like, I'd be kind of guessing. I'd be like,
there's so many words, there's so many clauses.
This looks problematic. And I can pick my way through a contract, but
sure.
I just, that's when I hire people who are absolutely
got you. So your experience lies more in the I of the three letters there. Okay. But as long as you've been paid adjacent, you are a professional in this area. And I say that not only to remind you of this, I try to remind people of this all the time. That's all a professional is. Just so you know, anyone. If you've managed to get someone to pay you to do something, you're a professional. If you've not been paid to do that thing, you're an amateur. That's it. That's the standard. Certification is great. That's why people say, well, I'm certified in. People can be certified in something and not be a professional if they've been paid to do it. If they've been paid, you're already a professional. If you can get someone in your family to pay you $1 to tell them about something you're excited about, congratulations, you're a professional. This is for all those people out there who tuned into this program. Why would they? But they did, who are struggling with imposter syndrome. You're a professional. Congratulations. What's it take to become a professional actor? Get paid, even in barter, even in deferred payment.
We should put a certificate on the Tumblr.
We should. Have you been paid? It's an honor system. And once you've been paid, you can print it out. You can fill in. I am now a professional blank. You can put it up on your wall.
Totally classic professional.
So I'm Brendan McNamara, a non-professional DEI expert, speaking today to professional DEI expert Andy Swindler. And if you can see the video, you'll be able to see that his face is doing his best to receive that, because that is not how he would classify himself. But no, that was all what all that sidelong stuff was for people who find that sort of thing informative or interesting. And also to know too, that when we examine issues like this, as we have in a multitude of occasions, these things are not just almost nothing we're talking about is purely theoretical. And it's just like, oh, it's fine when you're talking about the theory. These things intersect our lives and other people's real lives in a myriad of ways. And I think that's an important thing for anyone having these conversations with other people to remember. And it's something that I think we try to remember as well. That this all has to do with real stuff and real people. This is and theory is wildly important, but the theory is not very important at all if it doesn't intersect with real people's lives. So shout out real people. Pew, pew. All right, on to the outline.
Dun,
What?
dun.
Is intersectionality useful? You might have been like, dude, we're 15 minutes in. You've told me a bunch of things that are somewhat interesting. What is intersectionality? I can somewhat define it now that we've actually had a plenitude of conversations about it. But how would you define it, especially in the way you first encountered it? And then we can even backtrack from there of like what it is. That's why I say what it is generally, as opposed to what is it specifically, which I think is actually almost a separate conversation.
I think I first encountered it, early on. I mean, this was very, very. I think the pandemic had started, although maybe I was talking about this slightly before lockdown. But it was certainly before George Floyd. And within the Feel Real ecosystem, there was a husband and wife actually, and she is a DEI expert, and he's a longtime activist. And for what it's worth, he's a white man, she's a Black woman, and they wanted to like hold space for a discussion around it. They called it intersectionality. And I don't know, that might have actually been the first time I'd heard that word. And in fact, the Vox article that we were just looking at together, the intersectionality wars, like that was the reading assignment, so to speak, for that group.
Cool.
And there were three sessions about that. And then interestingly, the wife rolled off because, I don't know, her reaction, as I recall, was just like, she does get paid to do this all day long. It's a lot of emotional labor, particularly with a lot of the resistance she faces around it. And she was like, I don't need to do this on my off time. So she knew what she was committed to. And then it actually evolved into a BIPOC space within the Feel Real ecosystem, because that was something she was passionate about hosting. So that was really, I thought, a beautiful evolution. And then I ended up co-hosting the intersectionality space. So I kind of helped over and lead that on. And I don't know, like, I think part of the idea we had with exploring intersectionality was to like take a different identity, like, so I think, and like we had somebody on who was almost like kind of like you, like just a hardcore researcher, just like, oh my God, like she would just voluminous, she would just and like 30 references of things to look at, for the next session, which was to me kind of overwhelming because that's not my style. I mean, maybe I'd watch one of the YouTube videos or something. But I love the discussion. I mean, I love social learning. So I thought it wasn't like a requirement. It was just, here's a bunch of stuff. So that was kind of intriguing to kind of take it topically and be like, okay, we're going to talk about race for a few sessions. Then we're going to talk about gender, and it was, and I know out the intersectionality wheel, like kind of moving around the wheel in that way.
Spoke to spoke.
And so in a way, like that's kind of intersectional, but it's also deconstructing intersectional, because we're really just trying to look at one thing at each time. And I don't know that you're doing a great job of actually being intersectional about it, which leads me to try to define it, which is and especially the way Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term, 30 years ago, it was very specifically around the law and does the law look at somebody's situation, in the case, one of the cases I think was with an auto company and some Black women who were being treated a certain way, and the question she was raising was, well, is the law even capable of looking at the unique, I don't know, almost double oppression? I don't think that's the word she used, but like a Black woman versus sort of just looking at somebody being Black or just somebody being a woman, just race or just gender, and she was arguing. And then I grabbed some of these quotes, like it was fascinating, like how let's see if I can actually find it. Well, this is not a direct quote. Well, this is from that Vox article. Basically, the law seemed to forget that Black women are both Black and female, and thus subject to discrimination on the basis of both race, gender, and often a combination of the two. Oh, this was it. Then the court reacted and saying, in 1976, ruled against the plaintiffs, writing in part that Black women, quote, could not be considered a separate protected class within the law, or else it would risk opening a Pandora's box of minorities who would demand to be heard in the law. So that to me is fascinating, like how the court kind of reacted. And I'm not, like, to me, that just feels kind of lazy, in the spirit of what we're about. Like, to me, like the kind of essence of intersectionality is very much what we're about. Like, let's look at the complexity. Let's not be afraid of like actually looking at all these different, how everything intersects and crosses and bounces off each other, and what things belong together and what things can we abstract and extract. And particularly, like, when somebody has more than one, let's say marginalized identity, how do those, I've been describing it lately using the word stack, like how do those stack?
Or I've seen people have like literal formulas online where you can like enter in, you can like come up with your intersectional number or whatever. So it's almost like what do they add up to, or what do they?
I even did that in this. I may reference this article that I wrote earlier in the year called "Moving at the Speed of Care," privilege, energy, and action. And I think you read a draft of that before it was even published. And I did that. I attempted to kind of create my own score in a pretty simplified way based on my favorite, I think you call them intersectionality wheels. This is the wheel of power and privilege from Sylvia Duckworth. I like it for a lot of reasons. It's one of the most comprehensive. It's colorful. I think she's an illustrator, so I think she probably just hand wrote this kind of font. So it's got almost like a playfulness about it. It doesn't look like some heavy like academic model.
Like a bad Excel graph.
But as I was going through that, a big part of what I'm learning about myself, for the most part, the point of that particular wheel is to look at power dynamics and look at which identities tend to have more power in our society, which are closer to like the nexus of power, and then which ones do we tend to not cater to. And that could be something, I think a really obvious category would be ability. Like my brother's an architect, and years ago he was saying, like, the American Disabilities Act is a joke. Like nobody really pays attention to it. Nobody really builds for that, and nobody really polices it or
interesting,
holds people accountable to that. And I shouldn't say nobody, but it's like, it's a problem.
It's an honor system.
I'm like, and that one. Ableism is a category we probably don't look at enough in all the isms. But it made a, I don't know. I was going to say it almost feels maybe less charged than race or gender, but it almost shouldn't be. It's like actually probably pretty ableist to even say it that way. So, but I'm pointing it out because it's a category that, I don't know, I guess has become more personal to me lately. My dad this year, he has a degenerative illness, and he's wheelchair bound now. So all of a sudden, it's way more personal for me. And I think that's a lot of the point of this stuff, is when it doesn't affect us personally, particularly those of us who may have more privilege and power, are we honoring, let's go back to like the dignity and agency of the folks who are more marginalized and don't have access. And the other thing I've been exploring this year is being an empath, being highly sensitive to energy, which is a very strange intersection with being a white man. Because that's the thing I think a lot of people expect when they see me, maybe walking down the street, and kind of what are the implications of that. And I found myself looking at this being like, well, where does that even belong in this wheel? And I think that's part of the problem. And I'm curious, like I'll volley it back to you in a second. I wonder if that's part of your challenge with this, is just that it's inevitably incomplete, right? Just because any categorization, any thing that attempts to
Sure. Yeah.
humanity is inevitably incomplete. And I eventually learned like, oh, well, empath is kind of like this research around highly sensitive person, HSP, and that's now starting to be categorized as a kind of narrow atypicality. And so, so I'm kind of like, oh, okay, I guess I get to play in this. It actually even looks like Trivial Pursuit, if the kids remember that.
Yes. Oh, it totally does.
I'm
Yeah.
almost like, oh, I'm the green wedge
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. I'm in that slice of pie too. I'm key lime. Well, yeah, interesting. So we ranged ahead. So let's rewind a teeny bit to that is kind of how I intersected with intersectionality as well, was kind of in the format of what you're speaking of. And I guess if I were to define it early on from what I saw, it seemed to be almost a philosophy, but I guess you would call it a theory that there are multiple layers or multiple classifications of identity that apply to every single human being on Earth. And they not only exist as separate categories you can pull apart and look at, like take them out of the pie and look at them separately, something like sex or race, but once you put them back in the pie, that we get a better sense of the human person as a whole as we examine the multiple aspects of their identity. And so the intersectional part is like basically where multiple separate identity categories overlap or collide, where they quote unquote intersect. That's sort of how I had it kind of explained to me, but it did contain some of the elements that are actually I have the deepest questions about, because the second element that I thought that was fundamental to it, in the way it was first presented to me, or the way I first started interacting with it, probably in that same time, somewhere between 2017, 2019 zone is when I first started hearing about it. Although it entered the Oxford English Dictionary in that Vox article it mentioned in 2015. So it had already become common enough usage-wise to get to Oxford, which is a semantically conservative dictionary. And again, came from an article, which we'll get back to in a moment. It was an article for like a law journal, it looked like, or law review in 1989, a drummer, another summer, Get Down, Sound of the Funky Drummer. And the second part of it was, had to do with sort of, I guess I would say, power and privilege. Sort of privilege or marginalization, or privilege and oppression. And that to me, I think, was from the very get-go, I was like, wait a second, I don't understand the second part. I kind of get the first part. Like I'm already tentative on like the use of the first part, meaning like these are aspects of our identity that are in any way like truly germane. I was like, I could question that. We could talk about that for a long time, but not as long as the second part, which says certain identities have more inherent power. And it really seemed to be applied in the way that I first introduced it. Maybe it's different the way you came across it. It was very specifically talking about the United States of America. It was like absolutely US centric construct. And that I feel like fundamentally, because you'd have to rearrange it wildly if you took it to any other country.
Yeah. I think
yeah. But then just this week, I'm only on 6 pages in, y'all. So this is my level of expertise of reading the Kimberly Crenshaw. I don't know if is she a professor? Should I call her Professor Kimberly Crenshaw? Professor Kimberly Crenshaw's.
She is highly credentialed.
Yeah, she is highly credentialed. There might be a lot of letters. She has an alphabet soup at the end of her name. But when she originally wrote her article, it was specifically about only, this is interesting, gender/sex, which I think she uses both of those interchangeably in the piece so far. The gender and sex mean the same thing, and race. And so, it was about having a case specifically where they were like, no, you can either prosecute this as a gender discrimination case, in which case you'll probably lose because they've been hiring women since this particular year, or you can do it a race-based case, in which case at this particular auto plant, the divergence, the statistical difference was negligible between like high-level employees who are Black and high-level. So they're like, well, we're not racist and we were sexist, but we're not sexist anymore. And so we don't really know. Basically, they can get out of it because they're like, well, we don't know what the problem is, because you had to consider those things separately in the law. And Crenshaw was like, well, But wait a second. They're basically, so yes, okay, they didn't violate those in total, but they still are very, like, we have enough evidence in this case. They didn't have the evidence in the case. I don't even know if it was a winning case or not. It could have been a losing case. Black women might not have been discriminated. I don't know. I wasn't there, wasn't in the court, didn't read the court case. I just read her discussing it. And it seemed very salient and appropriate to me. What she was proposing was, well, no, as again, a cross section of these two elements, here is a group that they're specifically excluding. And it's not solely because of their race, and it's not solely because of their gender. And actually, this is the interesting part it invites. It might actually have nothing to do with either, therefore. And this is where it gets tricky, and why she was like, well, we can't just say it's not about either then, since you've disproven the two separate categories, which is what the brain rationally would say. We're not discriminating against women. We're not discriminating against Black people. So no, we're neither sexist or racist. But if they were discriminating against Black women, then oh no, wait, no, something's going on and we have to figure out how to address this. And she was saying, but there are overlapping or intersectional elements going on here, in which case Black women can be a particular category of discrimination. But they're saying in the law, they have no, that's not, that level of identity is not anything the law has even begun to approach. So in some ways, the Pandora's box thing is pretty savvy. It can either be lazy, or again, this is the spirit of conservatism saying, hold on a second. If we start breaking down, it'll get to the 8 billion. It's going to get to the 8 billion level where basically everyone is going to be like, you discriminated against me, and that's going to be illegal. And you're like,
laws for 8, we need 8 billion.
Right, exactly. So it's basically, when you don't hire me, I can bring a lawsuit against you as a Brendan discrimination suit. Or as we begin to just say, well, they can only be categorical, we begin to validate more and more categories as legitimate categories by which to separate people. When race, as we already know, is like a tentative. If we've already gotten into racial discrimination, we're already like, okay, this is a problem, and this is how we're dealing. Race, referring to each other as separate races, I would say is already a problem. It's not a good thing. It's a malnourished thing, and we need these laws ultimately, right, in order to make sure that people aren't thinking that way and acting out of that wrong think. So if we begin to add more and more categories, we're actually strengthening the case that these things are relevant. Like your sex really has anything to do with your capacity to work in an executive position at an automotive plant, for example. So yeah. I mean, in some ways I was like, oh, I can see that what is modernist intersectionality is not remotely what Kimberly Crenshaw was proposing. So her coined term is at best, like, again, like a grandparent or whatever. Although she does introduce in this article, I've already have a bunch of problems with it, her original thing. She introduces concepts of privilege and marginalization in there. So there's a lot of the ingredients are already there, but I don't know who took it. And that's a funny thing. This Vox article is really interesting that you've mentioned a couple of times, and maybe I'll try to remember to share it on our Tumblr so you guys can click on it and read it. It's fascinating. But to me, there's a missing link. I was like, how did it turn into, from what she said, into this like very broad, critical, kind of similar to critical theory, critical gender theory, critical race theory, blah, blah, blah. And Kimberly Crenshaw is literally like studied under some of the original like law professors who sort of invented critical race theory as well. So that is like a literal familial lineage. They're explicitly connected. That's not just like, oh, see, they're all the same. No, these folks are literally like know each other. How did it get into the realm of outside of what she spoke about it? And I don't know the answer to that, but I thought it was neat.
They give one clue. But first I want to say, yeah, I mean, I think you and I are fairly aligned on this. To me, I hope that most things like this, this body of work and others that are naming race are doing so because it's already a problem.
Yes, you would hope so. Yeah. I mean, no, hope so, not hope so. Sorry. Yeah.
Without naming something, without visibilizing it, without doing actual research. And, unfortunately, I don't know that we have better ways than social science to sort of, try to like build data sets around what's happening to groups of people. And I am with you. I if I'm right in perceiving a risk that becomes the new normal. Like all of a sudden we forget why we did it. We forget we were actually doing this to deconstruct the challenges and the problems.
Yeah, to stop making these things important. Yeah.
that becomes the way we categorize each other. And that I think there is a risk of that becoming its own problem.
Yeah. That's the Pandora's box, I think. It's not necessarily the getting people power, because I think in order to assume it's about power, you have to then assume that the person saying that is in agreement with you as to me, the part that I don't see yet, which is power, privilege, marginalization, that whole continuum, which we'll get into more in a second. But I was like, I think she had a similar response. She was like, see what they said? So that proves, and you're like, it doesn't prove anything. It proves from your point of view that if they thought like you, the only way they would say that is because of this. But you already know they don't think like you. So if they're thinking different, and again, as an actor, I am a professional actor. Me putting my head in other people's heads is like what I've done for most of my life since I was for 40 some odd years. So it's not super hard for me to go, oh, well, wait a second though, but they're not you. They're a different person. So they think different. And if they don't believe in the realms of, they don't believe in your presuppositions, Professor Crenshaw, that Black people are marginalized or have less power, or that women have less power, then they're saying this whole thing is a Pandora's box, because it's built on two presuppositions, neither of which we agree with. And that was implicit too, I have to say, in the very first document. She capitalizes Black, she doesn't capitalize white, and she continually refers to like white women as the standard for discrimination, but there's no proof of that. That would just be white women would be the standard statistically if they filed the most number of discrimination cases. That would be the only way in which they would be, and that would be like accurate and observable. But it would just be all women and any women. It just means there's no separate category for any race of women. It wouldn't be excluding Black women. It would just be like, well, what if they're discriminating on you on the basis of your whiteness? They would have the same problem. They would need this intersectional lens. And so I say that just be like, A, she had a false presupposition or an undemonstrated one. And then but intersectionality is still useful even with her potentially false presupposition, because intersectionality would be, a white woman would need it as well if she was in a place where she was being discriminated against specifically as being a white person and a woman. Then intersectionally, she kind of needs the same outlet for defense. It wouldn't be unique to Black people at all. It wouldn't be unique to Black women.
Yeah, I think if we're going to have an intersectional lens, part of the value of that is looking at, and because part of it is kind of like I was saying about being an empath, there are a lot of invisible identities that are marked that anybody can carry. And, I don't carry many marginalized identities as I look at the wheel and that framework. And so it's like, just at a personal level, I'm like, oh, well, it is hard to go through the world being energetically sensitive, and there's some extra care I have to take around that.
Yeah.
And I believe, just based on a lot of stories and evidence I've seen, that it would probably be even harder to be energetically sensitive if somebody didn't have, in something I was writing recently, I said, I have a lot of energetic insulation, and I believe that my work affords me that. I live alone, and there's just a lot of reasons for that. I don't take public transportation very much. There's just a lot of things I could avoid the energy quite a bit, frankly, or do it. Maybe it's one of the reasons I was attracted to interacting on Zoom, because I feel like it's a little.
Oh, sure. I'm in a safe cube.
And let's sort of loop back around, because that was really the main thing I was exploring that article I wrote, which we can also throw on the Tumblr, was kind of an expansion of something I had learned called spoon theory a few years back. And that was somebody talking about, because of all of their, I think, marginalized identities, and particularly, I think it was in the context of a health condition. I don't know, maybe you can relate to this, like just having less energy and just tend to this health condition. Yeah. But choosing to use a metaphor of spoons to say, I have to explain it to a friend and say, I have 10 spoons when I start the day. And, getting up and around and kind of just even getting ready to leave the house is 3 spoons. Yeah. And it helps, just be able to, her friend, quantify, like, oh my God, like, by that measure, I have 100 spoons and I only spend 2 spoons getting out of the house in the morning. And, and then I don't know, like, it's funny to me because I think that's a really cool body of work and a really cool way to explain it. And yet I was just like, I don't know, we're both really fascinated by words and the evolution of words. And we were even just talking about the subconscious and did people know what that meant 30 years ago? But I'm just like, well, I think we could just call it energy. Like, I think for us to have a shared understanding of like what energy is. So in 2019, I started just playing around with the kind of blending, and this was actually probably before officially encountering the word intersectionality, or maybe I had read it a little bit here and there, but hadn't dug in nearly as deep. And I became really curious about that. Like, oh, is that a way to talk about this? Like, that it costs some people more energy to move through the world and interact with the world than others. And we might just say, well, of course that's true. Like, that's
absolutely
the nature of things. And then could that be quantified? Could that be reliably connected to power and privilege and marginalization? And then I did want to quickly back, because I didn't weave this in, was they said this in the Vox article about when did intersectionality change. And the one thing they pointed out was in the 2017 Women's March. And it was an event whose organizers noted how women's intersecting identities meant that they were, quote, impacted by a multitude of social justice and human rights issues. And feminism is wrought with all kinds of debates about it, how racist it is, because a lot of feminism through the 20th century was mostly white women building support and solidarity and policies for white women. At least that's the argument I see commonly presented. So, and I think the women's marches kind of fall into that category. They tend to be organized and led, and I think attended mostly by white women. And anyway, Crenshaw's response to that at that moment in time was, I've never written that, I've never said that. This is just not how I think about intersectionality. So yeah, maybe just the nature of language, maybe just the worst game of telephone ever. I don't know, but I do know it's also connected to something you're not very fond of, CRT, and I don't think in this episode we're going to unpack that very much, because that's
no. But it is interconnected for sure. Yeah,
and they even say that, I think. And it's important to at least mention that her work around intersectionality evolved from her being a CRT researcher.
Yeah. I think that's interesting. Yeah, well, and it's interesting too, Women's March, in some ways, and her having that reaction is hilarious. And then in some ways it proves the potentially limited response of those in the court case she was referencing of, this is the Pandora's box. It's open. So now we're already in the period. The Pandora's box is open, man. Like, and it's full on, and it's already being incorporated into legislation. It's in very short order. If the Women's March was kind of like a crowning moment of its like full arrival on the scene, it is on the lips and tongues of politicians. It is absolutely being incorporated as a sort of presupposed fact in legislation. Even in the Vox article, it presupposed it was like, well, no one disagrees with this. And but of course, who said no? Like, it was like, we've spoke to many conservatives and they don't disagree with this part. And it was like, well, we don't really know what they agreed and disagreed with, because I agree with I've already told you how I think it's useful. Like, in the way Kimberly Crenshaw originally spoke about it, I'm going to say, in answer to the question, is it useful? I can see that being useful. So I would go ahead and say if that yes, in that we do, full yes, 2 thumbs up, that if we agree, that is useful for us to consider multiple layers of identity related causes by which people could be theoretically discriminated against. And that's the fascinating thing, because I think in some ways these are labels explicitly connected to harm, which is interesting. Like, it's literally about preventing harm. And that's one of the things I think that is, it's sort of like the jet fuel for, I think, why intersectionality became like prevalent so fast, because again, it's rooted the same thing that you and I have talked about. It's the sort of I don't know what the common grace of God, as probably I would refer to it, or maybe it would in 4 times past would be called as man's better angels. This thing was like, oh, we want to help. Oh, this will be helpful. But I think that was a presupposition. Again, I don't think people have asked this question, is it useful? I think people are just like, oh, this can be useful. Let's start using it. Again, that's the progressive mindset, right? Here's a new tool. Let's try this new tool out. It's very playful. It's lovely. You know what I mean? And I'm definitely more like, hold on. And once we play with it and I see it start stabbing people, I'm like, put that thing down. They're like, no, we're just not using it right yet. You know, I feel like that's the wrestle we're in. And the Women's March is fascinating too, because the Women's March was, at least from people in my circles, or adjacent my circles, I should say, actually, I had multiple friends that went to the Women's March. Actually, one of the first places I ever saw intersectionality outside of just like internet was my friend Karen had a necklace that just literally written in gold cursive, just said intersectionality on it. And at the time I was like, I don't know if I want to get into this conversation right now. And so I didn't. I refrained. And I regret it to this day. Like it haunts me years later, not having like potentially contentious conversations haunt me and potentially people like me for decades, y'all, just so we know. So every time we hold our tongue, we're taking on emotional labor.
Did it at least intersect with like gold and silver and
mining and exactly, mining practices. But anyway, so yeah,
like a multi-metal like thing.
A multi-metal, yeah. Here's my different identities. Well, it's just fascinating too. My friend Karen has actually done a bunch of collaborations, and I actually wrote with Karen, with this woman, my friend Nicole, who was diagnosed in her teens with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, or maybe not rheumatoid, it's just juvenile arthritis, and they didn't think she would survive much past her 20s. She's now in her 40s. And she was the person who introduced me to the Spoonie theory. They hashtag things Spoonie all the time, dealing with autoimmune stuff. And I think that's a cool way to look at it too. And I've often always I've used the metaphor of battery life, like on your phone, and that your battery drains differently. But what's interesting to me, and maybe we can start getting at this, that word, I think, is one of the big buzzwords for me that makes me go, hold on a second, I don't know if I can use that word yet. Marginalized. So like, for example, someone who has an autoimmune condition, I think and this may be just my incorrect semantic understanding of the word, like an autoimmune person, I would never call marginalized, because to me, marginalization, I think I put in that realm of like social implications, meaning they have been marginalized. As though it's a thing that's happened to them from outside of themselves, where of course with an autoimmune disease, it's your body's fault. Like your body is literally attacking itself. So it's all on you. So but if that aspect of the semantic range is appropriate, I can start using marginalized, meaning people can be marginalized by virtue of their choices and or themselves. So like me as an unhealthy person with autoimmune condition, which does drain my battery very fast, that's me. That's on me, dude. Like I'm marginalized by virtue of my condition. So I'm lower on the power scale. Literally, I have less stamina than a person who would have all the other characteristics of me. the multiverse me who doesn't have this has more energy than I do, most likely. But that's not, there's nobody like on top of me, or there's no oppressor in that scenario. Whereas I think I constantly think of marginalized as on the bottom of a hierarchy, and there is an oppressor, like a healthy person would be my oppressor in that case. But again, maybe I'm just thinking of marginalized incorrectly.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I would say it is. I mean, in the power and privilege wheel, it's basically like power in the middle and the marginalization on the outside. So part of that is like, if we let's put it back in the dignity and agency framework. So I think that is mostly speaking to agency in terms of power, right? So are marginalized folks, do they have access to change things? Do they have a voice? And then in some cases, especially like with body ability, that might literally be like, can I even move through the world in a certain way?
Yeah. Can I even get there can I get to the town square meeting? Yeah.
So, right now, my best friend is staying with me. You're like my best college friend. He's my best friend. Okay.
It's cool. It's great. My daughters have like 4 best friends. I mean, as a semantic conservative, you know what that does to me. It's a superlative. EST is a superlative. It's actually it's a singular category. Fine, whatever.
There's best, better, bestestest.
Top 5, top 10. Yeah.
Um, at one point, my best friend called us brosifs, so we just didn't even have to. He just invented.
I love it. Yeah, yeah. That way you don't have to put any superlatives on it. It's too much burden.
So my best friend is 7'2", 7'2" tall. He's a full foot taller than me. I'm tall enough. And I live in a pretty generous space, but there's 3 floors, and the lower floor is really, I don't know, maybe it's a 7-foot ceiling. I mean, he can actually stand maybe with an inch clearance, so that's okay. But in moving through the world with him, I'm noticing he has to duck through every doorway. Doors are like, I don't know what the standard is, but they're not even usually 7 feet tall, I think.
Yeah.
And so to me, marginalization, did an oppressive power like make him 7'2" tall? No, much in the way that you're describing your condition.
Yeah.
But then to me, that activates somewhat agency, right? But then the dignity part. So I hold that the goal as a society is to attempt to accommodate every condition as well as we possibly can, and to so that everybody has dignity and agency. And that's a lofty goal. And especially when we do standardize things, and this is in some ways because we've been able to provide, I don't know, maybe lots of housing based on sort of standardization. And in other ways, what if like the norm we used wasn't really the right mold,
it was incorrect,
or even if it's a majority mold. Let's just, I don't know, the 80-20 rule kind of comes up a lot. Maybe let's kind of arbitrarily say it's 60% in the middle is the majority. There's 20% who are marginalized, or 20% in power, just to kind of use a loose frame. So what if we design everything for the 60%? You could argue, well, hey, the majority of people are still being accommodated. And in all likelihood, that would also probably include the people in power, because they were the ones probably making a lot of choices about what was made. So maybe we could even say 80% are accommodated. Well, what about those 20%? So even if we didn't cause their condition, do we have a responsibility as a society to attempt to accommodate their condition, or to help them move through the world as easily as maybe the rest of us do? To make it more personal, when you were talking, I know about your condition, that it requires a lot of bathroom visits, right?
Yes.
So for you, I appreciate that you're not trying to blame the world for your condition. That's what I hear. Cool. And I wonder if, what would it be like? On the one hand, like an extreme example might be like, what if all the bathrooms in the world were locked?
Yeah. Which I got to tell you, for 2 years of the pandemic, that was the case. I mean, that was probably the highest anxiety for me throughout the pandemic, was the closing of public restrooms in almost every location.
So in that way, I would say you were marginalized because
by the choices. Sure.
And I mean, my God, we talked for hours about how the pandemic actually marginalized folks. I don't know that we use that terminology, but that
yes. Oh no, but no, actively and probably, I would say most likely intentionally.
Yeah, and then for you, that's like a symptom of all of whatever, for whatever reason people were. I don't know. I think it was because they thought like people using the bathrooms would increase transmissions, maybe, or something.
Yeah.
All the bathrooms were locked. I would say that decision didn't take into account people, maybe anybody who needs to use the bathroom, which would include.
I mean, literally, statistically, everybody, 100% of people need to use the restroom.
A few things we can be certain about, folks. And
everybody poops.
It's like, yes, I have no problem saying that you would be marginalized as somebody who not only maybe needs frequent visits, but it might be like a short fuse, right? Like you don't get a lot of warning.
No.
And now on the other end of that extreme is like, okay, should we put like a porta potty on every block so that so you're guaranteed access to a bathroom when you need it? Probably not. Like that's probably the solution. So that's how I think about it.
That makes sense. Next thing in the outline, what carried it from a theory to, is it an accepted theory for you? Do you feel like it's a salient theory that you're applying? Have you ceased to think of it as a theory, or are you still kind of in a playful middle place of like, no, I'm going to keep working this theory until such time that it no longer proves useful.
Well, like so many things that bear fruit for me in our discussions, you've helped me to unpack it even more than I had. I don't think it's a theory that we all have different identities and that they interact in different ways within ourselves and when we interact with the world. And again, we could extract that to just saying, well, that's 8 billion different ways of being.
Yeah.
Is it a viable theory within the law? I don't know. I don't really know what's happened with it in the law, to be honest. So that's
I don't either.
like, sure, it seemed like a good thing for her to point out. I hope somebody listened. I hope something changed.
Yeah.
I'm curious what, we heard the reaction of the courts, like, Pandora's box.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know enough about it really as its original legal theory.
Yeah.
Know kind of what happened to it. But is it, going back to what I said earlier, is it valuable right now to try to like analyze things, to separate things enough, to isolate things enough to analyze how that could work, and then to try to pile those on top of each other in an intersectional way to say,
yeah,
how could these multiple identities affect somebody in their life? I think that's all useful. Again, with the same caveat of like, well, hopefully none of us hold these as like absolute truths about ourselves, because they're implicitly limiting, I think, our ultimate full human expression.
Yeah. And I think that's a huge harm that I know people cite from people who don't like this very concept in general, where they're like, it's making people identity obsessed individually. I mean, listen, the claims about this have stretched all the way to, I'm trying to think of like edgy claims, like everyone's trying to figure out the rise in young teenage girls, especially anywhere from pre-puberty through teenage girls, are citing, I guess, gender dysphoria, are struggling with gender dysphoria, whether both temporary and seemingly lingering or whatever, however that can play out, a bunch of different ways. But the numbers have leaped to a radical degree, and everyone's trying to kind of figure out that why. Multiple theories involved. Well, one of the theories I do hear dominantly is, as this intersectional concept has become more and more prevalent and germane, especially in the marginalized and oppressor element. So to me, that's the live wire element of the thing that we haven't fully addressed, because I think we're talking about stuff that kind of does, I think, make a lot of sense or works, or it certainly makes common sense, I think, to most people. And I want to address that first too, so people can just be like, yeah, it's terrible, tear it apart. Let's look at what's flipping useful here, always, right? And it's unlikely that any theory that someone comes up with is just 100% trash. And I don't think intersectionality is 100% trash at all. But then the concern is, as people begin to see themselves on a continuum of oppressor or marginalized, there is an explicit, especially in the religious aspects, the woke religious aspects, that one, if you kind of tabulate your score and find out that you are essentially, by virtue of your score, you're kind of in the oppressor class, which makes you less spiritually valuable in the spiritual paradigm of like who's most important, who's the most important caste who we have to raise up and protect, the Brahmins, the enlightened ones. You can, by virtue of a limited number of things, accrue more points and like become more marginalized or oppressed by making a decision such as that. Like if you were to come out as trans, you immediately gain a whole bunch of points. Like on the scale, you might gain like 17 points or whatever in a day. So as a way to, and since young girls, is the theory, since young girls are especially vulnerable to social dynamics and to social hierarchies, that if you can just make a decision like that, to obviously separate your identity from your peers, and also like, who am I, right? In the teenage years, especially, you're like, who the hell am I? And you're going to try a bunch of things on too. And some of them are going to be right and some of them wrong, whatever. And people need that freedom to be able to have some exploration in that area. But if you're able to immediately advance in the social hierarchy, the intersectional hierarchy, by kind of coming out as something, coming out as gay, you could do it. You can immediately, like, you could leap up a bunch of scores. You can get points overnight. And so in there's a gamification aspect, or an inherent gamification within intersectionality of the oppressor element, which gets you away from not only just like being less spiritually wonderful, being like a lower caste system, but actually being farther away from being a villain. Because I think that's where a lot of people take that element. It was like, if you're in power, and I don't feel like that's completely accurate in terms internally how the system is discussed, but like, if you are privileged, you also are a quote unquote oppressor class. Therefore, that you're closer to the, like, you're the bad guy. Ultimately, like in the paradigm, in the narrative. But that's, again, that's making it a legal theory into something that you pull out in order to deal with discrimination cases, as pulling it out to a thing that you think about every day and all the time. That's part of the Pandora's box, I guess. And then the other one is like, is there, and this is my question, I guess, coming out of this, is there, does that even exist except in outside criticism? Is there an element of, like, if you are sort of like lower on the power scale, within an pro-intersectional space, does your voice hold more weight? Like, are you considered a more legitimate source of input, opinion, etc., if you're lower on the power scale or into the marginalized territory? Or is that just an invention of people who don't like it?
Yeah, I think that can be true. It occurs to me, one quick loop back, when I was talking about marginalization, I was really speaking to you and to my friend, and
yeah,
I think, really good question about, like, is it an oppressive force, or can marginalization? My answer was like, well, I think people can be marginalized. It's not always just the cause. It's just like, are we even as a society tending to that or caring about that? And I think it's a yes and, because the original part is also true. Like, if there is an oppressive force, then yes, on the other end of that are marginalized folks. Yeah, I absolutely, like, there's a body of expertise, of lived experience. I think that's really quite important. And sure, I have seen that lead to increased amounts of social power within certain environments.
Yeah.
Yes, I've seen that firsthand. I don't know, and I still believe that as many of those circles as I swim in, it can start to feel like the norm, but then I have to remind myself that I don't think it is. So I'm really curious about the research you just cited, because
yeah,
that sounds like it's maybe, I guess, much bigger than I had known. That what you're citing about, girls, and especially if that's changing really rapidly in terms of a reasonable measurement over time. I don't know, like, I don't, for me, if it's hard to imagine a scenario where somebody was really consciously doing that, where they were saying, oh, I'm gonna like claim this identity because I know it will give me power to look a certain way within a certain group of people. It's actually not that hard to imagine. I hope, however, that it's more subconscious, if anything, that it's if it, just to kind of riff on that particular theory for a moment.
Oh yeah.
Or the other option, I guess, is that this is a very natural expression that's been repressed. That what we're seeing is, some kind of liberatory aspect where it's
right.
like,
yeah, that's another dominant theory, right? Is like, as something becomes normalized, the people who always long to be this thing that people now accept are like, finally feel like they're running out of the shadows.
Yeah. So yeah, can more power be had, more social power be had by folks who are by folks who carry marginalized identities in certain circumstances? Yes. And I believe that, to me, is a corrective force, because at large, those identities, I think, are still marginalized and not cared about or tended to in the world, or actively oppressed or put upon by the law. But another thing you've helped me look at is not just settling for like anecdotal evidence, like what's really happening with how like the harm. I think that's something you and I are constantly coming back to and are both very concerned about, is harm reduction.
Yes.
But so let's accurately measure the harm.
I think that's huge, right? Yeah, because I think the thing we both agree on is, if nothing else, like anecdote or outcome is interesting. it's smoke, right? It might be even a smoke signal, and it's not unimportant, but it tells us nothing about causation. It just tells us outcome. But the great thing about outcome, or like, let's say, for example, if you were, I'm not saying anyone did this, but let's say the whole idea, the whole system, like let's just pick one spoke, right? The whole concept of whoever was in privilege or marginalized, could be based purely on outcome, right? You're like, well, because these people who look like this are identify as this, or are, I guess there's so many different categories, or are identified from the outside as this, occupy positions of quote unquote power. That would be outcome. And so all outcome tells us is I would say statistically divergent outcome. All that tells us is, hey, something's going on here. And I would agree that that's something that we should go ahead and inspect. I think to me, with intersectionality, maybe we can move into this next. My sense, this is just intuition, is that it leapfrogs from cause to causation. But it's like the cause has to be this. It has to be that the people in power are trying to keep power away from these people, whoever these people might be, or whatever, consciously or subconsciously. And this is the danger of subconscious, because it's like, well, they don't even know it. Okay, well, how do you know it? If they don't know it, how do you know it? Like we have to, and then so that's the thing I'm constantly curious about, because as soon as you start introducing marginalized, then you'd have to be like, oh, okay, well, wait. So to some degree, either that just means advantage or disadvantaged. Like if they use that language, I think I'd be more comfortable with it. To some degree, it depends on the category, but like abled and less abled, I was like, there's advantages and disadvantages here. But even I don't know, this leads me to the other questioning, it leads me to the other paradigm of like what success markers of outcome, like what even outcomes are we observing? And are those outcomes genuine or colonial is the thing I'm constantly been examining, right? Are they outcomes related to income? Well, who cares about income? Do you flip and love capitalism so much that you think the people who make the most money are the best off? Fie upon you. I despise that. You know what I mean? That's an argument. Or people are like, well, their literacy, their maternal death rates. There's all sorts of things that I think, again, because I'm pro-colonial, not exhaustively or exclusively, but I'm open to it. But from a colonial point of view, that's all like, if a particular group tends towards certain outcomes, it may be because they like those flipping outcomes. It's possible, right? That's always a tenable theory. So if someone is marginalized, they also might like being marginalized. They might like having their life super hard. I have certain tendencies. I've done many things throughout my life that specifically damage me, and I kind of like it. And so we have this constant thing of like, that, but you've invited an excellent concept, which is then what is our responsibility? And now virtue must be freely chosen, right? We've kind of discussed that a bunch of times. So is it an ethical, moral obligation for us to keep our eyes out for those of us who are struggling? And I would say generally, in a general macro zoom out sense, I'd say yes, absolutely. And that's why I dig intersectionality as a concept, just because it's like, I feel like this is someone's attempt to try to figure out how to do that. But yeah, but I want to can we look at do you have any example of like, it might not even be called the intersectional wheel, but like, because I know I've looked up intersectional wheel and it actually talks about all the complicated dynamics of what constitute power. And I was like, okay, that's too complicated. But I was thinking this in terms of like how you could almost, this is the way I see it the most, but it's also probably the most like BuzzFeed quiz. Hey, what's your intersectionality score? But like, I think that would be an interesting thing to examine and kind of break down what does it mean? Because I've always seen it as like, yeah, the Trivial Pursuit thing, or the thing, the circle with different colors. And then on each color are the deconstructed elements, which can overlap, which can intersect. So like, yeah, what's a good one to pick that's like,
maybe
the least questionable?
I can pull it up. The one I mentioned earlier from Sylvia Duckworth. She calls it the wheel of power and privilege.
Okay, there you go.
It's very slowly coming up. While that's coming up, there's one thing you reminded me of, which is one thing I appreciate that you've helped me look at it myself is my own use of hyperbolic and absolute language. It is quite common in a lot of these conversations to just be like, well, all of this class of people or whatever, and all of this class of people or whatever.
Yeah.
I just am not, I'm backing away from that a bit, hopefully in my own language. And then I'm noticing that more, because it can be a way to, well, it's almost like you're supporting the idea of nuance. I know that's not true, but
No. I would just say people who tend towards absolutes, such as I've done it myself, would tend to be. I think it's really just a form of laziness and or having run out of spoons. In which case you just go, I'm just going to say this thing. It's not even true, but I don't have the energy to properly formulate the sentence. And I think people do it all the time. And I would say all the time in the absolute sense, but I just mean it's going to occur many times a day if you interact with human beings. I've done it. I think everyone listening has done it at some point. And I have kids who are now literalists because I'm a literalist and I've raised them as such. And they challenge me, always, Dad? We always do that? We always complain?
I hear you saying all people do that all the time. Is that?
That's what I'm saying. Everybody does it all the time, continually. There's no time they don't do it. Oh, wait, can you? Oh, perfect. Right as you start sharing the screen, can you pause the recording? And I'll have to remember that this exists. I'm clapping for the sound. And then I'll just, I'll recut this. Because speaking of my spoons, I have to go drop some spoons in the toilet real quick.
Yeah, I'll pause it.
But I'll be right back. And then we can wrap this up in, I think, about 15 minutes.
Okay.
I'm just going to do another clap. So hopefully it'll be easy to see on the timeline. So yeah, let's look at an example like from the power, what is it? Power and privilege wheel.
Yeah, this is, there's a bunch of these. I've liked this one. I think this particular publication was late 2020. But I think, so you can find Sylvia Duckworth pretty easily on Instagram. And let's try to remember maybe to publish this. And I have a link to the most official version of this, which is on Flickr. Here. But my understanding is this is an updated one because some of the language even around neurotypical and neuroatypical was updated, and I can't remember what the other one was, but it's a thing there around the language where we're actually I forget the terminology exactly right, but we're often using language that still is centering kind of a quote unquote normal condition, and then like your proximity or like starting from that norm, and then the condition is then how much you're diverging from the norm. Which in some cases just, well, maybe always, like it just centers the idea of normality in a way that I hope some of the outcome of this work, as we keep kind of referring to the 8 billion, is that we are kind of drifting away from the idea of normal, like a homogenized norm, which is, I think, one of the goals of coloniality. But anyway, I drift away as usual. So what I like about this presentation, and like, because I don't know if we'll ever share this video, so hopefully somebody can look this up, or we'll share the link, but I will also describe it since this is audio. We're looking at the Wheel of Power and Privilege from Sylvia Duckworth. It's a rainbow wheel. It looks, if people get the Trivial Pursuit reference, it looks a lot like that. Basically, there are 3 rings of shaded areas, and each kind of wedge on the wheel coming out from the center is a different color. And then in the very middle of the wheel, it says power, and on the outer edge, it says marginalized. And this is what I do like about the word marginalized. So I'm with you. Advantaged and disadvantaged, I think, is totally fair game. Often privilege is described as unearned advantage. What I like about the term marginalized, though, especially in this presentation, is that it's visual, right? It reminds us that, like, the people we forget about, the conditions we forget about, or maybe we never knew about. Like it's just a constantly trying to remind us, I think, just to ask the question of, like, who's out there? Who's out there on the margins that, to what you said a second ago, do we have a responsibility to constantly be asking ourselves as a society and as a culture, like, are we tending to and then, the other part of this is about who makes decisions, right? So that's a lot of the idea of the power. And so one maybe evolutionary step would be, well, let's get the people in power to at least give a shit about the people on the margins. That's not really, I think, the ultimate solution. It's more, how do we actually redistribute and rethink, how power works in terms of decision making, and that's a whole other universe. But so would it be helpful for it just to go around the wheel in the different categories? Not like every single piece of this, but just the categories.
Yeah,
So,
the main categories. Yeah.
So starting with, it's also interesting, right? So I'm actually so race and gender to me tend to be the things that we focus on the most.
Well, the invention,
somewhat detrimentally. I mean, I think that's to me one of the values of this presentation, is that it helps me just remember all of these different identity markers, to even just have a conversation about them. I mean, I think that's how we even started some of those conversations a couple of years ago, was just like, hey, let's look at this, and let's just
break this down. What is this?
There's one really cool exercise where you can just some people call it like stringing the beads, but you just go around, if you're actually in a circle, great, or if you're on Zoom, you just kind of pick an order, and then people just name an identity, and you just go around a few times. And what I love, and actually we've done this in some of the surveying we've done for the Feel Real community, is like when people can really name their own identities and not choose. Like, this is kind of a multiple choice thing, right? It's like, well, here are the categories, like whatever we've said to almost to death that's a limiting factor, which of course it is. It's really, really amazing to hear how people like name their identities when they're not given categories, because really surprising things come out. And that exercise is a really good one. And what happens, we can call this like spiraling in a good way. Like, we go around the circle maybe 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 times, and then you start to hear people mention identities, like being a father is an identity, or playing the guitar is a kind of identity. That aren't remotely contained on this wheel. I don't think we have parenthood on here.
Well, I know it's funny to think about this is also, I'm going to speak to this briefly. This is a harm of intersectional thought, which is the spiraling that both of us have gone through on this program, where the rhetorical need to add so many caveats, which both of us do, and I think both of us speak that way naturally. So in some ways, that's the attraction to this sort of style of thinking. But it is hilarious to me, because I'm looking at this wheel right now. It's 3 categories per category. There's like 12 or 13 categories. And you were like, now, of course, this isn't very representational. And you're like, this is like, it's hilarious how representational it is, as something to just like, well, let's look at kind of a basic breakdown. And the basic breakdown is what is it? 3 times 12. I mean, it's like, okay. So it's like, 3 times 12, 30, there's 36. There's already 36 areas of identity that have been laid upon the spectrum. So it is pretty funny that you're like, yes, this doesn't represent infinity, but in terms of like doing something super simply, this is already it's heading way towards infinity. It's just fun. I don't know. I just think that's amusing.
I do too. It's just, I think we both hold that paradox.
It's very funny.
To finally go around the wheel. I'm actually horrible job of being inclusive in terms of anybody who everybody on this show is vision challenged, because we don't offer the video yet. But maybe someday we'll do that. However, anybody who could look it up, maybe be looking at it, that's great. But then if somebody was vision challenged, then I'm doing a piss poor job of actually describing this.
So we're back to the rainbow wheel. There's a rainbow wheel.
Back to the rainbow wheel, the wheel of power and privilege. And then I'm just going to read through the 12 dimensions of it. So skin color, which I do want to point out, on this show, we've mutually decided to use the term melanated. So I do find it interesting that she chose skin color versus race as an example. Formal education, ability, which I've spoken to a bit, sexuality, and just to make sure we distinguish that from gender, that's about who are you attracted to sexually. Neurodiversity, which would include categories like ADHD or being on the spectrum, as it's often said, or even as I was saying, like being highly sensitive person in terms of energy.
Mm-hmm.
Mental health, which that one's intriguing because I postulate that everybody's mental health has been compromised in the last couple of years, especially.
Yeah.
Body size, I actually explore that quite a bit in this article because I consider myself a large white man. I mean, I'm technically overweight, maybe borderline obese, especially right now. I'm not in the greatest condition that way. And it's fascinating because, okay, I'm going to go around the whole wheel and then I'll come back. So, housing. So a lot of my work actually here in Chicago is around, houseless folks. So that's near to my heart. Wealth, which a lot of folks, and I don't think this is a totally untenable argument, that like most things actually come more down to economic structures, but obviously they are. I don't know. Is it obvious? I think it's obvious they intersect. Language, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
are you a native speaker? Here, let's say in the United States, where we speak English as the primary language, like, and what is that? How does that intersect with how you move through the world? Gender, and this is, I think we're going to have a whole other conversation about, gender and sex, and but this is really getting at your chosen gender. Like, are you do you align with maybe the sexual parts you were born with, so to speak, or are you choosing a gender otherwise, or is there something non-binary or even something beyond all of that? And then citizenship, are you documented or not? And then I just wanted to briefly come back to body size because it's something it's a vulnerability for me. It's something I'm fairly insecure about, and also something I recognize that I have a lot of power to change. I mean, I'm tall, relatively tall, not so much next to my friend.
No one, almost nobody is. Yeah.
And the funny thing with this, that I'll just use this one example around my identity as a fairly tall white man in America. Most people would consider that powerful, and in terms of the most, I think, obvious form of power, which is physical prowess and the ability to literally overpower somebody physically, unless they were a brilliant martial artist or something. I actually do have a lot of power there, being in a large body. Now, in this, what I'm pointing out here is that in this scale, slim is in the middle. Slim is in the power, whereas large body is the margins. It's some kind of, it's almost like what you said. Like I take it on myself that I could lose some weight, and I have at different times in my life, and that's really well documented too. But it's just fascinating because I'm just, to me, this was the intersection that kind of spun me out the most, because I was like, yeah, but is that quite right? What she's getting at here, and it might be more true generally for women than men, I don't know, is that we have a typical beauty standard of being really slim, and that's amplified to the point of being like photoshopped, right? Like models and things being made extra slim, and Barbie dolls and all of that. So
although we're actually in a time period now where butt implants, pec implants, actually chasing largerness is what is being also paid for. Like literally people are spending money to try to make themselves larger. So
well, then I'm ahead of that trend.
You're like, and I'm doing it natural, baby. All natural add-ons. Well, so this is interesting. So we've laid out the basic structure. You can kind of at least visualize what this would be like. If you've seen these before, just look it up. Google it while you're listening to this program. Wheel of Power and Privilege, Sylvia Duckworth, as long as you're a person who can, who has access to the internet and can read. So I would say, as someone who's very skeptical about the whole intersectional version 2 or 3.0, whichever one this is, that if you took the word power, which is at the center of the wheel, and if you took marginalized out of it, I don't know if anyone would have a problem with this circle. I'm trying to say that slowly. I'm looking around it to be careful. I think people would still have Yep. here that these are yeah, exactly, these are sort of spectrums of different types of identity. People would look at this and go, well, I'm sure I have some problems with it. And this is, again, and this is like when you go to take a test and you're like, which what's a good example? Like, which Euphoria character are you? Right? And you answer a bunch of questions and it shows you where you are, which Euphoria character, which Friends character are you, or whatever, right? And you're like, oh gosh, I'm such a Monica. So if you looked at it in that way, you're like, oh, okay, these are somewhat useful. You still could very easily question, are any of these identities useful for us to consider? Some of them are, and you might disagree from spoke to spoke whether we should even be talking about such a thing. I do have to, so I think that's an important thing to say off the bat. Whereas I'm like, if you took marginalized and power out of there, I'm like, oh, okay, the graph makes perfect sense to me. Not perfect sense, but it makes a common enough sense. When you add power and marginalized, all of a sudden this diagram gets so confusing to my brain. And so I'm glad I have you to walk me through it. And I would need, if anyone ever brought this up, I'd be like, we cannot continue. You cannot just move on from this. You can't, if you go to next slide, I'm going to have to leave the room because my brain can't. I'm too much of an overthinker perhaps, I'm going to go ahead and give myself some credit. I'm a complex thinker. So I can't just go, oh, okay, yep, I get it, and move on. That's not how my brain works. So what's very interesting to me, body size is a good thing. Maybe we can even use that as, let's like break down a couple of the spokes and kind of maybe look at it in microcosm, and maybe it'll help us understand this.
Is there one of these that might feel the least controversial to you? Like,
the least yes, the least controversial to me, if you put power and marginalized back in the diagram. Well, actually, sorry, before I even say that, there's one thing that I think is, I can't decide whether I want to call it crazy or spazzy. It is super spazzy that I've heard that word is banned, so I'm going to use it as often as possible. Or, you know what, this is another thing that I think is just like become a generic bad term. There's something very white supremacist about the fact that there is no spoke for what Crenshaw would call gender, or what we as a society call gender, which is also biological sex, gender, kind of used synonymously throughout most of human history. There's no spoke for sex, for biological sex. And that's weird to me, because when Crenshaw invented it, it literally was race and gender / sex. And so there's no man or woman here, really, in terms of like, it's just, it's self-identity. So that's fascinating to me. And I'll be like, Mrs. Duckworth, I have some that is super strange. I don't understand that's in there, but that might be for another episode when we redesign the wheel of power and privilege, because there's a whole bunch of categories here that I can't understand why they wouldn't be here as opposed to ones that are here. But the one I disagree with the least or have the least questions about is, in as much as this speaks towards there's nothing absolute about it. Like if you're rich, you're not absolutely or inherently or inevitably allowed or have greater access to power. And so that's helpful. But I'm looking at wealth, poor, middle class, rich. Once you get to rich, you're the closest to power. I would say if that is speaking to, and maybe this is questioning what this wheel is doing, if that's speaking to statistical likelihood, then yes, I would say if you are considered rich or wealthy, it would be statistically more likely that you would have greater access to power than someone who's poor. But that certainly isn't any sort of absolute. But that's the closest one to something that I'm like, I think that's pretty legit. That if you're poor, you have less access to power, meaning if what we're talking about is power is sort of like social or legislative power. That's also the question. I don't know what we're talking about. So let's just look at it in terms of wealth. Because it's all in the same graph. So once we establish what wealth is talking about, that would then theoretically establish what all of these things are talking about. So as you see that one, do you see that one as the most like unassailable, like the most like least easy to argue, or do you see a different one?
And again, like a lot of people kind of even want to bypass talking about some of these other identities and just say, look, a poor Black person in Chicago might have as little power as a poor white person in a rural area somewhere, right? So
right, yeah, urban, yeah, urban, yeah.
Wealth could yeah, I think align us in that way. I don't know, for some reason my mind goes to citizenship, just
Mm-hmm.
in being literally connected in terms of documentation and the
Mm-hmm.
very real constant fear of being deported, and like, that one stands out as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I would say, well, yeah, but that might be similar to wealth and power. So as long as that's in your top two, we can do wealth and power. Sorry, wealth, wealth and power, poor, middle class, rich. What kind of power is this talking about in relation to this slice of the pie? Like from your understanding, as opposed to me trying to put mine on it and then asking you if it's right.
Yeah, I mean, just to try to connect it to some framework we use somewhat consistently, I'm the dignity and agency piece. To me, power is agency. Like,
Mhm.
One of my mentors said, well, look, in physics, power means the ability to move something, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's fair game. And I think we're not necessarily always talking about physical or, because it could be a law that, like, do people have access to change the laws? And that since we live, in a country where corporations have a massive amount of influence on our politics, to me, like, yes, wealth, could be connected to power in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, that's what I was kind of looking at and sort of assuming as well, that it would have to do with potentially like legislative but even in legislative, like, so then this is about sort of legislation and kind of law and policy making. Is the whole, okay, so then sorry, no, let's stay here. I don't want to keep zooming out. Let's stay zoom down.
It could be like, I'm wealthy enough to have an armed entourage, and like, we're gonna just literally go terrorize houseless people or something. I don't know. That's an extreme. But,
Sure. Yeah. But like, so I'm still trying to figure it out. So if you're rich, especially as the opposite of poor here, you have greater access to power. So rich people have less access generally to community power, because I would say rich people tend to live sequestered from larger groups of people, but I could be incorrect about that. Meaning like a poor person, I think more often would have greater access to community rapidly. You know what I mean? I think this, like, especially in terms of like, there are just simply less of them. So if these are about groups that identify, if you're identified with that group, you then are part of that tribe, essentially. So that would mean poor people have more power by virtue of there are more of them. So if it's in any way, if this wheel is allowed for people to be like, all poor people are essentially sort of bonded by some common identity here, then there are certainly more of them. So then this wheel of power privilege can't be speaking about generally statistical majority, right? Or so it can't really be speaking about physical power of these individual people, but instead it's access to alter the world around them. But in what ways? Man, this is why, my goodness gracious, this is complex. This is why even just the single one, which I think is the least disagreeable, is like, well, in what way? Because in what way? And then rich people, it's so funny, the body size one, large being on the outside. I mean, you look at Donald Trump or whatever, right? There's a rich person. Most people don't like how he used his access to power. He certainly owned property. He's full on obese. And so I actually tend to think of like rich people being like more likely to be fat. I actually think of poor people and rich people as more likely to be fat, and the middle class is more likely to be slim, interestingly enough. That's my sort of intersectional assumption. And I would say generally throughout human history, like if you were able to become fat, you're probably quite wealthy, because that would be a rare advantage. But in terms of political power, rich people have less political power by virtue of their vote if they're a group, because they have less people. But I would certainly say, due to corporate influence in the United States of America, I can certainly see how that would be more powerful. So their access to those who actually have power. I guess that's the interesting thing, because power is in the middle and it's connected to stuff, but it's separate from all of these categories. So heterosexual people don't explicitly have power, but they have access to power. Rich people don't explicitly or implicitly have power. They have access to power. And that starts to make more sense to me, because this is always my difficulty. I was like, every person, whether you're poor, middle class, or rich, you have the same essential power within yourself. Like you have the power to make decisions. You have the power to like whether to go try to kill somebody or not. Like if someone's sleeping and you have access to them, you pretty much all have the same power until we're getting into elements of like physical strength and that sort of stuff, in which case body size becomes very important. Okay. But yeah, I'm still just trying to figure it out. It's still very confusing, but I still think I mostly agree with it. I don't know.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to pick it apart, and it's like that thing, you don't know something until you teach it. If I'm in that role in some way.
Yeah.
So credentialed, but I do need to bring us to a close so I can go have dinner with my papa.
Oh, lovely.
And I don't know, maybe we do a part 2 where we just really dig into every single one of these dimensions on the wheel.
It's fascinating. It's very, very fascinating. So yeah, I would invite anyone to, again, if you haven't looked this up yet, look it up, take a look, and then, yeah, maybe let's have a further conversation about it. Cause I'm really, that once we get to this ding dang wheel, like this, the wheel of power privilege is fascinating to me. And and the cool thing is I don't go fascinating. I don't like it. I would love to know more, and I'd love to explore more with you. So I enjoy getting to explore up to this point today already.
As do I. I love you.
I love you.